Hi, you guys. I am so excited to have this awesome turnout for our discussion panel on consent. I am Aileen Nelson. I work with the Rape Counselors of East Alabama. So a little bit about what we do. We provide 24-hour advocacy and crisis counseling for victims of sexual assault. We also provide free community education, which is what I do as the prevention educator. So a lot of what I do is I'll go into schools, I'll go into the community, I'll teach about consent, I'll teach about bystander intervention, I'll teach about preventing sexual assault through combating cultural norms. So that's what we're trying to do here today, having an open discussion about consent and why it's important. I will let my co-facilitator introduce herself.
Hi guys, my name is Faith Nomchef. I'm a victim advocate and outreach coordinator with Rape Counselors, and we're so glad to have you guys all here today.
Great. So for all of our panelists, I will also let you guys introduce yourselves, but just as a disclaimer before we get started, we are going to be talking about sexual assault. Some of these subjects are difficult for some people to listen to. If at any point during this call you get feeling kind of weird, please feel free to mute us, walk away from your screen, whatever. Katie, who is helping facilitate our chat, is going to drop some links and some hotline numbers for some helpful resources in the chat now for anybody who might need them. And then, so why are we here today to talk about consent? This is so important. Huh? Oh, sorry, I thought somebody said they couldn't hear. So, why is this discussion about consent so important? It's because sexual violence occurs when consent isn't given. So sexual violence is anything from rape or sexual assault, domestic violence, stalking, anything that you have not gotten the explicit consent of someone else to do and you do it anyway, which is a crime, it is wrong, and it can affect anyone. It's really important to talk about because 1 in 4 women, 1 in 6 men, and 1 in 2 trans individuals will experience sexual violence in their lifetime. And every 73 seconds, someone is sexually assaulted in this nation. So that's why we're here to talk about it today. It's a problem. We are filming from Auburn, Alabama. I want to note that it is Muskogee Creek Indigenous land. I think that that's important to say too, because that's 1 in 2 of American Indian and Alaskan Native women have also experienced sexual violence in their lifetime, which these statistics are all staggering, and that's why we're here today. So I will let our panelists introduce themselves. I'm super happy to have all of you guys here. You are all super knowledgeable, and I'm really excited to hear what you have to say. We'll start with Vickie. I think she's our executive director with Rape Counselors of East Alabama.
Hey, thank you all for joining us. My name is Vickie Deering. I'm the executive director of Rape Counselors of East Alabama, and I also serve as a victim advocate.
Brandon, if you want to go next.
Yeah, I'm Brandon Hughes. I'm the district attorney for Lee County.
Great. Vernon?
Hello, I'm Vernon Williams. There's some echo there, I'm sorry. I'm a retired Army officer, and I currently serve as the administrative assistant to my pastor at my church. And I'm a father and a son, so that's why consent's important to me.
Great. Regan? Regan, unfortunately, we can't hear you. I don't know if anyone else can.
I can't hear her.
While you're getting that sorted out, I'll let Courtney introduce herself.
Hi, everybody. My name is Courtney. I'm a PhD student here at Auburn and a 4th generation Auburn alumni. Before I came back here to get my PhD, I worked with victims of sex trafficking, first in Bangkok, Thailand, and then in Atlanta, Georgia. And I'm happy to be here with y'all tonight.
Great. Melissa, take it away.
Hi, I'm Melissa Sawyer. I am the coordinator of violence prevention and survivor advocacy, which means I oversee our violence prevention efforts and campus's victim survivor advocacy safe harbor.
Great. Regan, you got everything going maybe?
I think so. Can you hear me?
Perfect.
Awesome. Okay, cool. Yeah, my name is Regan. I'm an undergraduate student at Auburn, and I'm the president of Period at Auburn, Alabama.
Great. Well, thank y'all all for being here. I also want to introduce our two interns with RCEA. They're Dondra Williams and Katie McGilvery. If you guys have anything to say, please do. Katie's going to be monitoring the chat today, so if you guys have any questions that you would like to ask, we'll address them at the end, but please send them directly to Katie. Dondra is here with questions from our social media. All right. Awesome. So,
hi, I'm Dondra, and I'm an intern from a social worker, MSW social work intern from Baylor University, and I have been with RCEA since August.
Thanks, Dondra.
And I'm Katie. I'm also an intern with RCEA, and I'm a senior at Auburn, majoring in global studies and minoring in human development and family studies.
Awesome. And thank you guys for being here, all of you. Thank everybody from the community, from Auburn City Schools, everybody who's here. I'm so happy that you guys came out. So what I want to do to get started is just discuss with our panelists how you guys define consent. So that could be, you know, when did it become clear to you? How did you first learn about consent? If you have anything that, you know, you've had taught to you that made it really clear to you, like a metaphor, a definition, how you think consent plays into your life.
I'll go first.
Great.
And if I'm out of order, let me know. I look at it, I guess, from a somewhat different perspective. From, you know, I have to look at it from the legal side, really from the criminal side, and really what I try to get across, particularly whether it's to prosecutors in my office on how we look at sexual assault cases, to law enforcement, to juries. One thing I really have to go over with juries and grand jury especially regarding the issue of consent is I think too many times people look at it as, did she have an opportunity? You know, they don't look at it as a consent issue. They look at it as an issue of no. And I think that's two different things. I mean, you're either in a condition to, they say, well, she didn't say no. Well, the question isn't what did they say? The question is what condition were they in? Because a lot of the times what I'm dealing with when it comes to consent, most of the time it has to do with someone in their mental or their physical or mental capacity to consent, right? So, you know, when we're trying to explain to these folks, and it works in favor of the person who's accused as well. You know, when somebody brings an allegation that they were assaulted, and well, you know, and we had one fairly recently where they had been out drinking, but the question is, was this person impaired or they just couldn't consent? What was the communication going on? So it does work, you know, to both sides, and that's what we have to work through and have to make sure. And it's obviously much more difficult than it sounds because the jury is sitting there looking, and we have some law enforcement, and you know, and prosecutors look at it the way of, well, did she have an opportunity to say no? Did she just not say no? Versus saying, yeah, I understand she didn't say no, but was she in of the mindset? Was she physically capable of saying yes? And I think that's how we really need to get the mindset to be. That's what the issue is, because the law says that the person was incapable of giving consent. Not that she couldn't say no or whatever, but the person was incapable of giving consent. And so from that perspective, that's the way I approach it. And it's hard. It's a hard concept for some people to grasp because they're so used to just saying, well, did she or didn't she say no? But this idea coming from the other perspective of, well, did she say yes? And that's the way I've approached it from the legal side.
So I guess I'll jump in behind Brandon. This is Vernon, everyone. Having been a father and then also a commander in the Army for several years, I always had to tell my soldiers, you know, just like Brandon said, were they able to consent? Meaning, if she's impaired from drinking, if someone drinks one sip of alcohol, my mindset was that she's incapable of giving consent because she could be impaired. And you can't obviously tell at what point someone becomes incapable of doing so. So just if there's alcohol involved, then just know that consent can't be given at that point. And so also from having a teenage son, you know, obviously we don't want them to have sex out of wedlock, but I mean, we know kids, and you know, you're at a party or you're with this girl and you think that she's telling you, or I was getting the signals, you know, without her verbally communicating to you that this is okay, there is no consent. So you have to be very mindful of what you're doing, and just, you know, you want to seek that consent. As odd as that might sound, you want to be certain that, you know, the person that you're with is giving you that okay. And, you know, I always kind of phrase it, or, you know, flip it on its head and tell my son, hey, you have a sister. Wouldn't you want her to give consent before she's out with some guy and he takes advantage of her or something like that? So consent is very important, and it's near and dear to me because, like I said earlier, you know, I have a mother, I have a wife, and I have daughters. So, you know, I want them to give that consent if something like that's going to happen.
So I'm going to come at it from a slightly different angle. I think, like a lot of people, conversations of consent growing up were certainly about bodily autonomy and sex. And I think getting older, I learned that we negotiate consent on a daily basis in all kinds of settings, right? Whether it's picking out what we want to eat with friends, all the way to sexual contact with people. And so we tend to get really weird about consent when it comes to sex and treat it like this brand new thing that we've never negotiated or navigated before. You'd asked about earlier memories, and I remember what it was like being really little and feeling like I had to hug people I didn't want to hug. And I distinctly remember as a child what that felt like in my body, to not feel like I could say what I did or didn't want with my body. And I think that that's probably one of the earliest moments that I connected what consent was to me. But like I said, it's unlearning that this is this unique situation that we navigate only in these really intimate interpersonal settings.
I'll go along with what Melissa was just saying, because I've been with RCEA for about 25 years as a volunteer, for a few years, and then as the director. And I remember early on with my children and trying to teach consent and realizing that, you know, a lot of times when people even bring up the topic of sex, it's like, oh, I don't want to talk about that with my kids, or I don't know how to talk about it. And then one thing I can remember from an early training was kind of like what Melissa said about hugging, is that it's okay to teach your children at a young age what they are comfortable with and what they are not, and that they can express their consent of not liking something. And one story, I was at a training and they gave the example of tickling a child. And that was, you know, we tickle our own children or our cousins or our niece and nephews, you know, my kids will do that to each other. And it's like the moment that they say stop or no, you don't just keep tickling them until they think that they'll like it. You stop the moment they say stop or no. So I think that early on was such a good example that I learned from my own just teaching my kids, because there's stages of their age when you can teach them about consent so that they can report it or say no or say they don't like something. And then the older they get, they know how to ask, you know, if it's okay or if it's not. And then, you know, just different aspects of consent, knowing that it's okay to change your mind, you know. It's okay to know what you're consenting to have that, you know, being very specific. And I think, you know, when it comes to sex or in being in a relationship, to know that just because we did something one time doesn't mean that you're consenting to it every single time. You can always say no or stop a situation anytime that you get uncomfortable. And I think that people don't realize that, or if they are in an intimate relationship, they think that it's just an obvious, you know, yes, but it's not.
I can tell you an example. We had a girl, an Auburn student, who had a guy in her apartment. It's a long story how they got there, but he was asleep on the couch. She was in the bed. He kept asking, let me come in there, let me come in there. She said, no, no, no. Finally, it's about 4 a.m. She's like, look, if you'll just shut up and let me go to sleep, come on in. So she invites him to her room. She's wearing Nike shorts and a T-shirt. She rolls over to face the wall, and of course, what he does, I think she said she knew he took his clothes off. This wasn't a rape, but he starts rubbing on her like, you know, a 20-year-old college kid would do. She doesn't say anything, and she just thought she she's sitting in my office and she's upset and she's crying. And I'm sure this was unwanted. But I asked her, I said, at some point you told him to stop. Did you tell him no? Did you elbow him? Did you do anything? She said, no, I just figured he would get the hint. You know, some college boy is supposed to get the hint not to do anything when a girl is basically allowing something to happen. And I said, well, why didn't you tell him to stop? Why didn't you say no? And she goes, well, that was confrontational. I didn't want to make it weird. And I didn't want it to be weird in the morning. We had to leave. So, and she's asking me to, asking us, whomever, the grand jury, the police, to charge this guy with a crime. Now, he didn't penetrate her into do any of that, but he just rubbed on her till he was done. No clothes came off of her. But the point being is, dadgummit, if you don't want something to happen, you got to say something. Because obviously this guy was in a position and he wasn't going to, he wasn't getting feedback in one way or the other, but he dang sure wasn't getting any negative feedback. So I hated there was really nothing in the law that we could do because clearly she didn't want this to happen. But when you look at, well, what does the law say? The guy was touching her and she didn't say anything and it just kind of went on. So getting past this mindset, I don't know if it's a generational thing with this, because I can assure you, when I was in school, girls didn't have a problem saying, hey, we ain't doing that. But now I don't know. It's this idea. I don't want to hurt anybody's feelings. I don't want to make it weird. I don't know. There's just and it's frustrating for me as a prosecutor to get somebody in that, really there's nothing we can do, because the law does require for certain crimes, some act of saying, hey, no, stop. Doesn't have to be a lot, but it's got to be something.
Brennan, I think you bring up a good point in terms of what legally consent means versus consent. So if we're talking about sexual violence, those kinds of experiences exist on a spectrum, and not all experiences violate the law, right? So someone can still have a violating experience, even though it's not necessarily a crime. And I think that what you're describing is someone not giving consent, even though it may not have met the legal requirement or the legal definition. And so that's why these discussions of consent and what it looks like and how do we teach people how to negotiate it and feel empowered is so important.
And I think that goes along with, too, when you teach people. We've done some classes, especially with college, like a male population, and they don't realize that there's actually a law that says it is breaking the law if someone is incapacitated, they have had too much to drink, or like Vernon said, anything in his opinion to drink, that they are not able to make that decision, yes or no. So and you'll talk to a lot of people, and especially in that college setting where we've done a pre and post test, and they just don't even realize that isn't a law, that if they are incapacitated, that they cannot give consent. And so they're asking, well, then what do we do? And it's like, well, you just go home for the night, and then if you want to talk to this person tomorrow, and then get consent on what is something moving forward. But when they are not in that, where they're incapacitated, then that it is against the law. And I think, like Melissa said, it's so important that we do this education in our communities and with our young people so that they know what is against the law, what is a crime.
That is a mindset I think that's changed over time. When I was in college, if your date passed out, that was basically the end of the night. I mean, it was kind of no questions asked. Whereas now, for whatever reason, it's like an invitation to party. And I don't know how in the world we got to that point, but you see stuff over and over and over again. In fact, I would say if a guy, I was in a fraternity, if a guy had done that to a girl while she was passed out, I think the fraternity would have handled that themselves with the guy. That just would have been unacceptable. And how we've gotten to this end of the spectrum, I'm not sure. But to your point, Vickie, clearly, either they don't take the time to think, they don't know it's against the law, or they just don't care. And I think that has a lot to do with it. They don't care. They don't think they're going to get caught. Because really they rarely do, because just for, and this just for various reasons, but the spectrum has swung the other way for some reason. And that's something that I think is a big part that we've got to get corrected somehow.
I'll share what I think consent is. My name is Courtney again. I'm actually going to go back and say what I think consent is not first. And I'm coming from a perspective of working with victims of commercial sexual exploitation, or sex trafficking. And first thing for people to understand about trafficking is that anyone underage cannot consent to sex. And so that means they can't consent to sex regularly. They can't consent to sex for money either. And our laws didn't really reflect that for a long time. But a minor cannot consent to sex. Also, when we get into the area of exploitation, someone who is participating in sex to get their basic human needs met is also not consent. We call that survival sex, prostitution, if you want to call it that. But if someone needs to engage in a sex act in order to eat or to have shelter, that is still an exploitive relationship and is not true consent. And just because somebody doesn't call for help or say no or run away, that also does not mean consent. And that's important when we're working with trafficking victims, trauma survivors, because there are psychological manipulations that occur with people who are victimized. There's legit fear that if they call for help, if they run, that it will make the situation worse. And so oftentimes people don't ask for help. And that does not mean that they are consenting to the act that they have to participate in to ensure their own survival. Our survival instincts are very, very strong and really just kind of amazing. That's a rabbit hole that I won't go down. So what is consent? Melissa, you started talking about food. And so my analogy, you might have heard this one. Have y'all heard the pizza analogy before? Yes. Okay. Melissa has the pizza. Y'all, okay. So a couple of weeks ago, I went over to a friend's house and he was like, let's order a pizza. And I was like, okay, well, I only like certain kind of pizza. Like I don't like all pizzas. And he was like, that's okay. Well, what do you like? And I was like, I like pepperoni. He was like, yeah, okay, I like pepperoni too. What about crust? And it was like, okay, well, I like thin crust. He was like, yeah, I can do thin crust. That works for me. And we ordered the pizza and we shared the pizza. And I think that consenting to sex should be that mutual companioning and discussion of what do you like, what feels safe to you. We don't force feed Hawaiian pizza to people because some people don't like pineapple on their pizza. And instead of this conversation of giving and taking, we're sharing. And I think, Brandon, one of your questions is why has it gotten to this point where people think it's okay to act in a certain way? I think it's because this generation of young people has had the ability to access pornography quicker and easier than any other generation. And right now, statistics are showing the average age that a child first views pornography is 11 years old. And so for a lot of these young people, their first sexual experience is pornography. And so it's teaching little boys and little girls, if I want intimacy, if I want connection with another person of the opposite sex, this is the way that I'm supposed to engage in that act. And when you're older and you're looking at pornography, you can say, this isn't real. This isn't reality. This isn't what it's really like. But little boys and little girls do not know that. And then those little boys and little girls become men and women.
Courtney, I love that you brought up that metaphor. I had it ready to go on my browser and I went ahead and threw it in the chat box. There's a great TED Talk that talks about switching the language from like sports metaphors to ordering pizza, and it's really useful.
Well, we've done some presentations just in the past year, even like last couple of years, that it's like a cup of tea. You guys have probably seen that. We can share that. But then back to food with that. I saw one today when I was looking up, and it's also like French fries, that it's freely given, reversible, informed, enthusiastic, and specific. So I love that they do have these way of expressing what it is so that people can relate to it. Or I love that it's like a bike ride, like it's like a bike ride or a cup of tea, and all these examples. We're especially trying to teach our youth because they can grab onto that and really understand it in that way.
Absolutely. So going off of that, thinking about, teaching our youth about consent, right? Some people talked about, teaching kids bodily autonomy and body sovereignty, where you're not going to put them in a situation where they have to hug a relative where they feel uncomfortable, where you're teaching them how to share, how to ask their friends about, what do you want to watch on TV? What do you want on your pizza? That kind of thing, maybe in a less literal manner. But I wanted to ask you guys, when do you think we should start teaching consent? How And how then when we get to sex education, should we integrate that?
I think it begins very, very early, because I think what it starts with, because a child's not really going to understand, I don't think, to a degree, consent, or how do you have a conversation with a 3 or 4-year-old about this man who wants to stick his penis in your vagina? I mean, and I understand that's an extreme example, but I think you start identifying with these children. I think you can do this very young, because right now, how many times, and most of y'all don't have children on here, I don't think, and the ones that do are probably of an older generation where they didn't have cell phones like me when their children are growing up, but children are used to having their photographs taken 1,000 times a day, whether they're from their parents or friends. So teaching them, so when a stranger comes along and says, hey, that's a pretty bathing suit you got on, can I get a picture of that? They're so numb to people taking the picture, they don't see that as odd or crazy or weird or dangerous. So I think you start there saying, all right, who can take your photograph? Who can't take your photograph? What do you do if somebody that you don't know tries to take your photograph? Then you move on to, listen, I know it's cute and funny and all, I guess, to talk to your children about calling their private parts, a kitty cat or a pocketbook or any of the 1,000 other things that we see in child sex cases. But you teach them, that's your vagina. Because guess what happens if a man comes up to a little girl or says, hey, can I touch your kitty cat? She goes, oh, you talking about my vagina? You want to touch my vagina? Those people, that protects that young lady from something happening, because somebody that knows that this person has sexual awareness or body awareness is going to be less apt to try to violate somebody like that. So I think before you get to that point of consent, I think you start laying the foundation that way.
I think also, I have a 9-year-old daughter who I consider advanced. And so we try to, like Brandon said, tell her what her body parts are, the proper names for it, and to become aware of her body. But I think also we have started to make her aware of her own personal space and privacy. And, even though she loves me to death and I'm daddy, well, at 9 years old, she doesn't change in front of me. She goes to her room. She does all of her things with her mom, and, they have those conversations, and she's aware. So now that if there's some other guy who's trying to see her body or touch her body, she's like, well, my dad doesn't even do that. So I'm certainly not going to allow this other person to do that. So that's kind of the way we approach it.
I agree wholeheartedly with what's been shared. My sister has 2 kids, and so it's been really interesting, particularly being in my line of work and also talking to her about parenting. And some of what I've seen her do that we've talked about and that I've really appreciated is they've just normalized asking for permission and saying yes and no, sharing toys and hugging and high-fiving. And even they had a cat that was getting older, and she would say, does the cat look like she likes being picked up like that right now? And just really normalizing paying attention to the way people are responding, like nonverbal cues, asking for permission, respecting what people say.
I think those are all really great. I also think that it's really good to set a good example, right, where you're always the one who is asking other people for consent, children especially too, because then if another adult even in that situation sees that you're asking a child like, hey, do you want to do this? Hey, is this okay? Obviously in a non-sexual way, but like, hey, do you want to hold my hand? Do you want to take a picture? That opens up an opportunity for you to use that as a platform to talk to them about consent as well. Faith, anything to add?
I'll add, if you don't mind, the importance of talking to children about secret keeping. If you set the example in your house of we don't keep secrets, surprises are okay, but secrets are not okay. Because a lot of the victims who I worked with, even as adults, they were victims of childhood sexual abuse. And a lot of times it was a secret, or they were told to keep a secret. And so teaching the kids that anytime an adult says, can this be our little secret, that's a red flag for them.
The only thing I really have to add is I think it's so important to teach children about their bodily autonomy and that they have the rights to their body. Because I can even think back to times in high school where like someone would grab my butt or something. I didn't know I had the right to say no to that or to not make it a big deal or something like that. So I just think teaching that early on and making them know this is your body. You get to decide what happens to it. You get to decide what you do with it.
Absolutely. So obviously, by teaching children about consent, we're helping normalize that like as a part of our culture and as a part of our daily life, right? When we teach kids how to do something, it follows up through the next generation. When we're asking for consent ourselves and we're setting a good example, so does that. But I mean, Courtney brought up a really important point that not just in pornography, but also in the media in general, we're kind of shown that either coercion or like almost taking someone by force is like a strong and sometimes sexy thing to do. I saw this analogy when I was doing research for this panel that it was like, if you're watching Fast and Furious, you know that that's not how you're going to drive a car, because you can walk outside and look on the street and see people driving cars in a normal way and not running people down and going on the opposite side of the road. When you're seeing in pornography, which is, like Courtney said, a lot of children's and sometimes adults too first kind of views and perceptions of sex, where they get it from, you can't just go out on the street and see a normal portrayal of sex, because that's typically something that happens behind closed doors. So how can we kind of combat that, where people are getting this almost misinformation? How can we challenge like concepts of masculinity that you're taught to be a strong man, you don't take no for an answer in certain situations?
I guess I would have to take it from a spiritual standpoint, in that as a married man and with a wife, you're a protector. You know, you're someone who wants to shield your wife, your daughters, your family from any type of harm. So when I look at it through that prism, for myself, I really don't see how the two would line up. So, you know, we always just try to, in upbringing our children, and my sons in particular, to just kind of let them see it from that perspective. You know, a woman is not, her body is her own, and it's not something that you possess. You know, it's something that she gives to you freely of her own free will, and it's not something to be exploited.
There's an initiative out of Oregon where they do this really fantastic job, where they talk about comprehensive sex education is sexual violence prevention. When we know about our bodies, when we know about sex, when we know about healthy relationships and how to have conversations about readiness and contraception and all of these other pieces, one, we can tell our readiness based on our willingness to have the conversation. If we can't use the words for our body parts, if we can't ask someone if they want to have sex, then we shouldn't be having sex with that person, right? And so when we talk about that, these skills, whether you use them tomorrow, the education or the skills, or when you're married 10 years from now, education is power. And if we can focus on emotional intelligence and healthy communication, I think some of the stumbling blocks, especially when we talk about masculinity, is that there's this assumption that men in particular in heterosexual relationships should read their minds and be sexy and take what they want and be assertive and be manly. And really, we negotiate consent all the time, and we have to ask, watch, and listen. We have to pay attention. It's ongoing. There's often confusion about body language, and people will say like, either we can't trust body language at all, or I'm only paying attention to body language. First of all, we're not like naturally skilled at paying attention to body language. And secondly, relying on body language is most useful and impactful when it's already been established that people can set their limits and that those limits can be respected within that context before we're not relying on our words. And so I think just really normalizing that this is something that we're constantly figuring out. We should be having conversations, even if it's clumsy or doesn't feel very sexy. Like, this is part of being an adult, and these are part of having intimate relationships.
Melissa, I love that you brought up education, because that is something I think that we at RCEA are very heavily trying to do, just raising awareness about consent and doing the consent education in the community, that Aileen is actually getting to start going into high schools and talking to them about consent when we go in to talk about healthy relationships. And we are so excited for it. And it's just, I think it's crazy to look at it and be like, it's 2020. Why are we just now being able to do this? And I talk to college students all the time, and we'll go in, I'll be like, how many of you guys have heard of consent or been taught something about consent before this? And it's alarming to me how many have not. So yeah, I think that education piece is so important.
That was all really beautifully put. Does anybody else on the panel have anything they'd like to add before we go into questions? Okay, great. So,
sorry for the delay. I'm trying to pull up my resource here, and I got sidetracked. So there's this, when we're talking about parents talking to their children about sex, I found this really great model called the ABCX model that I think would be really helpful for parents, and I've shared it with some of my parent friends, and they have found it to be very useful. And I am trying to find it so I make sure that I say it correctly. I am so sorry about this, y'all. But I didn't want us to move on before.
No, Courtney, while you're doing that, I want to just share the definition of consent that RCEA teaches and has been teaching. We use an acronym that's easy. So consent is easy. That's our ... It's easy. E means it's enthusiastic. So the person who you are having sex with should be obviously like very into it. You should be able to tell. They should be happy and verbally confirming that what you're doing is something that they want you to be doing. A is able to be retracted. So even if someone has said yes to doing something, if they change their mind, they have the full right to do that at any time. S is for sober. I feel like I'm doing an ABC book. Sober being that obviously they're able to consent, right? If someone is under the influence of alcohol or drugs, they're legally incapable of giving consent. And then Y means it's a yes. You should be getting a verbal yes. There are gray areas when we're teaching about consent that people see and that people argue, and I acknowledge and validate that, but really the only way to confirm that you're getting consent and that someone is enthusiastic and that they do want you to be doing what you're doing is if you get a yes. Courtney, resource?
Yeah. Sorry. Okay. So the ABCX model is a totally different theory. This is the ABC and D model. So sorry, guys, you're going to be getting a lot of letters here. And again, this is specifically for parents, but I think we could use it in terms of our being community educators about consent. The A stands for autonomy. So helping people understand that they have autonomy. What does autonomy mean? In what situations do they have autonomy? The B stands for building, and that means building good romantic relationships. that good romantic relationships take time and they need to be built. They need to be invested in. The C stands for connectedness, and that connectedness is with parents and caregivers, because it's important for young people to have healthy connections with safe people in their lives so that they can make good, safe decisions when they're connecting with people in the future. And D stands for recognizing diversity and removing disparities, because not everybody's experience is the same, and we need to keep that in consideration when we're talking about these issues.
Absolutely, thank you. I will look more up on that one and maybe share it in our schools.
I can send you, actually, I can link the article where I found it.
That'd be great in the chat, yeah. So speaking of the chat, if you guys do have questions, we're gonna ask everyone to stay muted just because, other than our panelists, obviously, just because there are, thankfully, thank y'all for being here, a ton of people here. So if you guys do have questions, please shoot them privately to Katie McGilvery, and she will read them out at appropriate times. But what Dondra is going to help us with, one of our other interns, is she's going to give us some questions that people sent in advance from social media for our panelists.
Okay, the first question is, how can consent change? And what are some nonverbal signs that a yes has changed to no?
I think I'll just answer one part. I think I said it earlier in the meeting, was that, it can change by if there was a time you were intimate, or like at the beginning of your relationship, or even some part of the night, that there was always any time that they want to change their mind, someone can, change their mind and say no to any act, that even if it was something that they experienced together before, that it can always be changed, and like Aileen said, reversed, and they can change their mind at any time.
Okay, the next one is, if someone is in a long-term relationship where asking before every physical touch is no longer a thing, how can couples separate their physical worth from their partner's denial of physical affection, kiss, hugs, sex?
Can you repeat that just one more time? I want to make sure I get the whole question clearly. Sorry.
Yeah, that's okay. That was kind of long. It says, if someone is in a long-term relationship where asking before every physical touch is no longer a thing, how can couples separate their physical worth from their partner's denial of physical affection? And then in parentheses, kiss, hugs, sex.
So I think that the important thing to remember is that asking for consent means that you are ready and willing to accept when someone's answer is going to be no, and not take it personally. I think that part of being in a committed relationship with someone is realizing that them declining physical affection doesn't mean anything about the nature of your relationship, and not taking that and assuming something a step further, but just being willing to accept that bodily autonomy, just because you're in a relationship with this person, just because you've been intimate with this person before, it doesn't necessarily mean that something is wrong if they don't want to do something again. It just means that they're exercising their right to say no. I don't know if anybody has anything else to add on that.
I think if I understand the question correctly, so we've worked with many survivors who have come to us and asked us for help, and just talking with us through our hotline or even in our office after their assault. And maybe they were in a relationship when they were sexually assaulted, and of course, going through that traumatic experience, they are not feeling like they want to have sexual intercourse with their current partner, and they're just struggling with that, and they've had a hard time just explaining and being open. So we always just tell people, just be open and honest in your relationship, letting them know how they feel, why they're experiencing, maybe not even why, but just letting them know that this experience that they went through has changed their mind for that. Or we even have some people who will call and they've just had a certain trigger, something that had happened either through a movie or a song or some kind of experience they went into, and they may have been sexually assaulted years ago, but their partner may not understand then, or they may not even be aware of the assault. You know, not everyone shares those experiences when they get into a relationship later on. So I think it's okay just to tell people, like, just to be open and as honest as you want to be. But, you know, I always tell people, especially our survivors we, you know, work with, is that if they're not comfortable sharing that experience with them, that's okay, that's something that happened to them and they may not be ready, you know, to share that with their partner.
I'll also add that in a committed relationship, you grow and change and mature, and things don't always stay the same. Hormones change, people have children, and in that relationship, you are constantly invited to grow and change together and renegotiate boundaries and change the things you like and things you don't like and try new things. And so it can go, you know, what seems to be very positive, what's difficult, but a lot of that is very natural and normal.
Yeah, this question is a really interesting kind of mix of so many things. Could there be a difference in their sexual desirability right now? What are the gender norms that they've absorbed about what it means to be desired or be desirable? Is there stress? Have they changed? Are they still interested in the relationship? I would strongly recommend talking to a counselor, either as an individual or as a couple. I think that could be really worthwhile to figure out where this kind of misconnection is.
So,
Okay. Oh, go ahead.
We do have a question in the chat. What are some ways to reteach consent to a survivor of childhood sexual abuse?
I can share some of the things that I've done. One of the things that is very important to us when we are working with victims of exploitation is giving them choice. Everything that they do, they get to make a choice, from what they're going to eat for dinner, to what activity they want to participate in. And for a lot of these individuals who were being sexually abused at a very, very young age, where it disrupts worldviews and makes it confusing about what is good and bad and safe and unsafe, we allow them to start making decisions in a safe space. So that when they do need to start making those more difficult life decisions, they are more confident in their own decision making. And it's a slow process, but it's actually very empowering for them to practice those things. And you can do that you can practice that with your friends as well. Let them start practicing making decisions instead of maybe they say, oh, whatever you want to do is fine. Like challenging them to, no, let's make it, what do you want? What do you like? What do you want to do? And have them practice using their voices.
Okay, another question was, in a long-term relationship where consent is nearly implied, how should couples approach saying no to their partner, and how can their partner respond?
The partner says no, and the other partner says, all right.
Short, sweet, and to the point. I think it's getting comfortable saying no too.
Ditto.
Yeah.
My daughter's on here, so I ain't gonna get into it. But you know, that's guess what? People say no, and you move on. You know, it's just part of life, man.
When I think back to what Courtney and Melissa said, you know, relationships change, but I think the first important part of that question that John just said was that they're in a committed relationship and they can be open with each other. And like Melissa said, I encourage, you know, if someone is going through a hard time where they can't communicate that with them, to ask them to get some counseling, either personally or together as a couple. But if they're in a committed, if that word to me made it where they should be able to share that with each other.
So I think we might have answered this one. Wrapped up in that one is, when in the relationship should couples discuss what it means when their partner says no? When in the relationship should couples discuss what it means when their partner says no?
I would say ongoing.
Ongoing, and probably as early as possible in their relationship. I think it's good to communicate that so that the other partner knows, or they each know where they're coming from and what they are willing to do.
I completely agree. I think that as I'm teaching healthy relationships and like safe dating to kids in schools and to young adults in schools, one of the things that I like to stress is healthy communication, especially with consent, because when you have healthy communication built up where you can talk about what you're feeling and what you're thinking with the other person, it makes it easier with, touchier subjects like sex for people to express their needs or to say what they're wanting or not wanting. And that helps everybody.
In my job, I deal with a lot of people who just clearly have an impulse control problem. I don't think it's this idea that they're entertaining one thing or the next. And I don't think, I understand if you got young people kind of dealing with this issue, but when you got grown people that just can't accept somebody's answer, these people don't have an issue. That their issue is impulse control. That's usually what I see. And there's usually something, and y'all know that, it's something much more at issue than it is, well, I want to do something right now and you don't. But I don't know what you do about that person.
I'm going to try again and hope my sound works. And if not, I'll type it into the chat box. But I just want to acknowledge how vulnerable it is to initiate sex or to try to be intimate with someone when you could be rejected. In Brene Brown's research, people of all ages have said that that's one of the most vulnerable things. Is it still 100% necessary? Absolutely. And we can't skip asking for consent because we don't want someone to say no. We still have to do it, but I also think it's important to recognize that it can be hard.
So we have another question. Is there even such a thing as implied consent? And the writer adds that they feel like that can create unsafe expectations.
I could tell you the only place implied consent exists in the law is regarding drinking, driving, driving impaired on the roadway. Outside of that, from a legal perspective, no.
I agree. I think that in the previous question where they said where consent is almost implied, like even when you're in a relationship with someone who you've done something with 100, 1,000 times before, I think it's important to always get consent.
I think going back even to what Melissa said, no implied consent, just ask the question. If you are not able to ask the question, then you probably shouldn't be engaging in the activity. So it really shouldn't be a big deal to just ask a question as you're going through.
I will say, and this is not talking about instances of violence, but especially when we're talking about long-term relationships, again, when it's been established that someone can set limits and have those limits and boundaries be respected, then I think that oftentimes long-term couples with high levels of trust can use body language, a nudge or withdrawing. There are lots of things that I think that obviously we want to be verbal, but I do think that there can be maybe less structured ways when trust is super high.
I think like anything, you get to know the person you're with, and you talked earlier about reading body language. Well, that's hard for a couple of college students to do, but it's much easier if when you've been with somebody for 20 years or 15 years or whatever, you know whether you want to accept it or not, you know the feedback that you're receiving.
And Brandon, you bring up a good point. We're also really terrible about gauging body language when we've been drinking and it's a new partner, which is one more reason why sexual experiences should be sober.
So there's another question that kind of goes off of this one as well. Should consent be applied in marriage, and if so, how?
I think it brings up, well, first of all, thank that person for their question, because I think it brings up a very thought-provoking question. Can someone in a marriage be raped? And the answer is yes. So, I mean, there has to be consent even within a marriage.
I wholeheartedly agree. Does anybody have anything else to add for that one? Okay, so with all of that being said, I want to thank you guys all for being here. And what we like to do at the end of our podcast, which we have a podcast here at Rape Counselors of East Alabama, it's called Yes Means Yes. Faith runs it, and it's lovely. We discuss topics like this, like consent, healthy relationships. It's good stuff. It's on Spotify. But the way that we like to end that podcast is with any closing thoughts and messages for survivors of sexual assault. So I want to open that up to our panelists if you guys have anything you'd like to say before we sign off.
I think I will just say that you're very brave and you're very strong and you're doing a great job of healing, and to be kind to yourself and give yourself the same amount of grace that you give other people, because you're really doing a great job.
I guess my message would be that, look, at every level, from the time it happens, you've got support out there. Know that, and you take advantage of it.
And I would just add to that, that you're not alone. That, again, like Courtney said, you're brave. We are here for you 24 hours a day. Even if you just need to talk or ask for how to navigate the system, like Brandon said, if it's something that just happened, we have the process of just taking you through the hospital steps, through the court system, and we're there for you the whole way. And anytime you have questions or just need to talk to someone, we just always want you to know that you're not alone. You always have someone that will support you.
I would just add that your experience is valid and you're worthy of time, attention, and healing, regardless of context or when it happened and what you've chosen to do in order to heal.
Great. Thank you all for all of your input. What we're going to do now, Katie just sent in the chat, it's a link to an evaluation for this panel. We will be giving you a certificate of attendance if you fill out our evaluation form. It would also be great for us to get some data for our use about what went well and what didn't. Other than that, Faith will be putting up some of our resources on the screen, including the RCEA hotline, if anybody wants to screenshot it, just to have these in your back pocket. If you or someone you know has been sexually assaulted, these are some places you can call. Thank y'all all for being here. Take the opportunity to screenshot, and then you are all welcome to go. Thank you to all of our panelists. Thank you, Vickie. Thank you, Faith. Thank you, Mom. Bye, y'all.
Yes, thank you guys so much for joining us.